believe in the ripple effect.
What's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Ricardo Renz, also known as Ricky Renz, and a great episode for you today. Today we have returning guest, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. Last time he was on was episode 132, and if you're not familiar with him, he is one of the most respected people in the ketogenic world. As you guys probably know if you've been listening to the show for a while, it's a diet I have adopted into my life. My wife and I do it, and we have been doing it for a long time. We do our best to eliminate as much sugar and carbs from our diet. It's had amazing results in regards to just controlling our hunger, cognitive ability, joint pain, and so much more. And we get into all that and a lot more. The first time Dr. D'Agostino was on, we talk a lot about the keto basics. At that time, there was less people doing it, less people knowledgeable about the diet, and now obviously it's become much more popular. Thanks to him doing a lot of interviews and helping bring awareness to this diet and the benefits of it. Soon after being on the Ripple Effect podcast for the first time, he went on the Joe Rogan podcast. He was on Tim Ferriss's podcast. He was on Dr. Rhonda Patrick's podcast. So he really was a big part of getting this information out there and getting people at least curious with the diet. He's also the reason why I eventually had Jim Abrams on, who started the Charlie Foundation, and I'm sure you guys have heard me talk about that podcast and that story. If you haven't listened to it, check out episode 210. And another great future Ripple Effect podcast guest that came on thanks to Dr. Dominic D'Agostino was Dr. Thomas Seyfried, and he was on episode 159, Keto and Cancer, Manage and Prevent Disease. And it goes into his book, Cancer as a Metabolic Disease. And he's another guy that's really fascinating. If you listen to those three podcasts, the one with Jim Abrams, the one with Dr. Thomas Seyfried, and the first appearance of Dr. Dominic D'Agostino on this show, you'll learn a lot about the ketogenic diet and all the research behind it and potential benefits, disease-fighting benefits, and disease-managing benefits of the ketogenic diet. And I want to be honest with you, because this was an amazing show. Thanks to Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. He's an amazing guest. Check out his appearances on all those other shows. He's always worth listening to, and definitely a mainstream guy who's willing to look at not so mainstream perspectives on things, which I absolutely love. But I was I don't know if I was a little sick. I didn't really have any symptoms besides some brain fog last week. I don't know if it was stress. Sometimes you have some weight on your shoulders, some things that are lingering that you're not even aware of, but is having an effect on your ability to focus. I know that a couple people in our household were a little under the weather. It could be a small cold or virus I was kind of trying to get out of my system. It didn't seem that serious, but it did have an effect on my performance last week, and I feel bad, and I just want to say my apologies if I seem a little more scatterbrained than usual. I know you guys are probably used to it by now. Obviously, the goal is to do this podcast full time, so I don't have those other things in the background that are stealing my attention and stealing my focus, and I can focus on doing the show. But unfortunately, until then, sometimes this does happen. And it also didn't help that I was having some audio issues. For some reason, every once in a while, I get this hiss from my microphone. I don't know what it is. I don't know if it's the heater that's in my basement. It seems like sometimes when it's not on, I don't have that issue as often. Unfortunately, it's cold in the winter in Massachusetts, and it's necessary from time to time. So that could be an issue, but that was also a little bit of distraction. But no excuses. I definitely have to do better, and I have to make sure that when I have somebody as intelligent and thought-provoking as Dr. Dominic D'Agostino, I do my best to extract as much interesting and important information from him as possible and give you guys the most thought-provoking conversation possible. With that said, if you want to help with the goal of making this my full-time gig where I don't have any other distractions or focuses going somewhere else and I can give you the best shows possible, consider supporting the show. And there's multiple ways you can do it. We have a Patreon page where you can support us monthly. We have a PayPal account if you want a one-time donation. We have a merchandise store, and I have some logos that are like 99% complete and ready to be released in our merchandise store. So please check out the merchandise store. I have a crypto wallet if you want to donate that way. You can also download my music that you hear in the podcast. It's my solo project called Theory 6, and it's available on all the major music platforms. And then also my Rockfin page, which is a video platform where you can donate to the podcast that you're listening to. So that's another great way of supporting the show. And then last but not least, I'm sure some of you guys are familiar with my good friend Richard Grove, the creator of the Tragedy and Hope website and also the host of Grand Theft World podcast. And Richard also has something called the University of Reason. It's an online university, but not one that's easy to describe. If you guys have ever heard Rich on the podcast, and he's been on a bunch, you have heard him discuss how to optimize your skills, how to find a passion and make it a career. And whatever line of work you're in or whatever line of work you want to go in, you will be able to find a course that can benefit you. And I think right now there's a lot of people who have woken up to how unfulfilling their lives are, or how they're working jobs that don't really make them happy, and they want to pursue a passion project. They want to do something more with their lives. And that's why we started this partnership, because this podcast, of course, has always been about trying to bring some type of value to the listeners and to myself. We all grow, we learn, and his courses aren't much different. So if you sign up for any of his courses, it will benefit the Ripple Effect podcast. It's one more way you can support the show. I truly believe there's a lot of podcasters, journalists, artists, whatever it may be out there listening to this podcast who want to change their lives and they want to take the next step to do so. And I think Richard can definitely help, and his courses can definitely help. So check out the show description, click on the links, take a look around, and let me know what you guys think. Thanks again, guys, for listening to the podcast, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.
And thanks for being, one of the platforms that allowed me and the other guests you had to talk about this, because it has made a big difference, not only in public awareness and education, but it has also stimulated quite a bit. And I do think it's because of podcasts. I know because of podcasters, because sometimes university professors will reach out to me and say, hey, I heard this podcast. And I literally, just before I got on here, someone from a major Ivy League university just reached out and said, I heard you on a podcast. I saw that you're kind of a leader in this field, and I'm setting up a big clinical trial, and I'd like your help. So I want to thank you for providing a platform for me and others to talk about the ketogenic diet, the clinical applications of it, and what we have done and really focused on is emerging and expanding applications of the ketogenic diet. So I know you had Jim Abrams on, and his son, Charlie. His story really inspired me to develop therapeutic ketosis as a means for neuroprotective anti-seizure effects for military applications as it pertained to something called central nervous system oxygen toxicity, which will, if not mitigated, will create tonic-clonic, also known as grand mal seizures, in Navy SEAL warfighters using a closed circuit rebreather. So it's kind of a lot to unpack there, but essentially what being in a state of ketosis can potentially enhance our performance resilience. That means being able to perform optimally and safely in an extreme environment. And that's really what we kind of put me on the map, because early in my career, I was developing technologies like hyperbaric atomic force microscopy, laser scanning, confocal, electrophysiology. And we do these things inside these chambers that simulate everything from a deep sea mission to like a space environment, hypobaric. hyperbaric to hypobaric. So in the process of doing all that, and I was probably deep into that when we did our first podcast and working on experiments and publishing things like that, we've moved on to cancer. And that was great that you had Dr. Thomas Seyfried there. He actually inspired me. This goes back to 2009, actually. And then my first student, Dr. Angela Poff, who is a co-host of mine for the Metabolic Health Summit. So I'd encourage your listeners to check that out, where he will be speaking, where others, speak on metabolic therapies and ketogenic diets. But we've expanded in many different ways to further develop, optimize ketone supplementation. So that could be ketone esters, electrolytes, which are bound to ketones. There are many products on the market, but most of them are not very good. So we actually test and develop ones that are good. And we use these for everything from different seizure disorders, metabolic disorders, cancer, lowering blood glucose, exercise performance, and a whole host of different disease processes. Angelman syndrome is one. So there are rare diseases, genetic diseases, that are pathophysiologically linked to metabolic dysregulation and changes in neurotransmitter systems, where the ketogenic diet or supplementation can help to restore metabolic homeostasis in the brain, but also neurotransmitter balances like the glutamate to GABA ratios, for example. We're interested in adenosine and other neurotransmitter systems being altered by diet. As a neuroscientist, as a trained neuroscientist, I did not even really give any thought to the idea that a diet could change your brain neurochemistry. That didn't really occur to me too much until I delved into seizures in my fellowship training. And then the seizure drugs were not really working for the application that I was funded to study. So I kind of searched quickly, what do people do who have drug refractory epilepsy and seizures? And then I came across Jim Abrams and the movie First Do No Harm with Meryl Streep. Meryl Streep did a movie about the ketogenic diet, which was very interesting to me. And then that set me on the trajectory to really go deep into understanding the role of nutrition, not just the ketogenic diet, but ketone supplementation and just nutrition in general, too, in optimizing brain health. And we're digging deep in that into many different areas. So that's kind of where we stand now. I would say we have about a dozen different projects going on. And I sent you a list of, just some of the publications and stuff.
Yeah, one thing you hit on that I think is really important too is that there's a lot of products out there. Obviously, anytime a market is created, people are going to try to profit from it. I get people sending me pictures all the time. They're like, hey, is this keto? Is this keto friendly? Is this healthy? And I'm like, just because it says keto, it doesn't mean it's healthy. It'll be full of, so, you'll have the low carbs and no carbs on the nutritional facts, but people will just ignore the ingredients, and it'll be full of vegetable oils or cheap whatever sweeteners. And so it can be a little deceiving. For somebody who's maybe listening for the first time, they hear the word keto kind of get thrown around a lot, but not quite sure what exactly it is. Could you give just a rough idea of what it is, and then we can get into why some things that are keto aren't necessarily healthy?
Yeah, that's a really good point you bring up, and maybe as it pertains to the general public, probably the most important point. And I should probably emphasize it more in my podcast and stuff. But you're right. Most products are not keto. I wear a continuous glucose monitor, and I use, blood ketone measurements and breath ketone measurements. The Readout Biosense device is very good for that. So a ketogenic diet is the only diet that I'm aware of that's defined objectively by the elevation of a biomarker of a blood or urine or breath metabolite, and that's ketone bodies. And there are three of them: beta hydroxybutyrate, traditionally measured in the blood; acetoacetate can also be measured in the blood, but urine ketone strips will detect that; and then breath acetone. A ketogenic diet and a ketogenic product is not ketogenic unless it elevates and sustains ketones, or may not necessarily sustain it for a long period of time, but it has to elevate, ketone levels. So if you're eating a quote unquote ketogenic diet and you're not in a state of clinical ketosis, which is a blood ketone measurement of 0.5 millimolar or above, then you're not on a ketogenic diet. And so the diet is defined by a macronutrient ratio, specifically, and this has changed over the years, of fats, to fat being the highest concentration, the highest percentage of macronutrient in a ketogenic diet would be fat content. And then protein levels are adequate, but not excessive. And early ketogenic diets were a little bit probably too low in protein, and that impacted the growth of children, pediatric population. However, and this is the main criticism, that it can stunt the child's growth. Charlie, Jim Abrams' son Charlie, is like, he towers over me. He's like 6'3" or 4" or something. And he was put on this traditional, ketogenic diet, and he outgrew his parents by a long shot. So a ketogenic diet is a macronutrient ratio that when you eat it, it shifts your metabolic physiology from burning primarily carbohydrates and sugar to burning fat and also ketones. And then the ketones have a functional role of replacing glucose as a fuel source for the brain. So it becomes an alternative energy substrate for the brain. And when the brain is exposed to these ketone bodies, it actually changes neurotransmitter systems in ways that we are studying that have a neuroprotective, anti-seizure, anti-inflammatory effect. And what our lab does is really goes deep into those mechanisms that ketones are working. And we try to quote unquote hack the system, biohack. I don't really like that term, but I guess that's what you're doing. When you're supplying ketones in the form of supplementation, you can circumvent the dietary restriction that's typically associated with getting into a state of therapeutic ketosis, defined by elevation of ketones. And then, you're doing that from our perspective to treat a metabolic disorder, to treat epilepsy, to treat cancer. These have different functional effects, like reducing inflammatory cytokines, which could be important for different diseases. So the ketogenic diet, a state of ketosis, can be achieved with fasting. And I'm fascinated with fasting, intermittent fasting, and caloric restriction. It's kind of how I got into this track. Or a specific macronutrient ratio that you eat with that's eucaloric, meaning that you're ingesting as many calories as you need to sustain growth and your weight. It mimics many aspects of fasting, which is kind of interesting. Or you can consume a ketone supplement, which will elevate ketones for anywhere from 30 minutes to some products to several hours for other forms of different products that are out there. And there's dozens of different kinds of exogenous ketones that we can talk about. And we sort of have a library catalog of many of them that we're testing. And so there's different ways to do it. And I think the type of diet you do and the type of supplement you use will be very context dependent, depending on what your goals are. If your goals are just to, lose weight, that's one type of diet. Your goals are to manage seizures. That's a quite different type of diet than a general lifestyle ketogenic diet.
Yeah, one thing that is interesting, because you talked about height, and because your diet can affect your hormones. I'm sure you've heard the theory that they think the reason, and I don't know if this might have been in CJ Hunt's documentary. He's been on the podcast too, The Perfect Human Diet, which was a really good documentary. This idea that because of our diet and our lack of nutrition in our diet, it affected our jaw and its ability to fit all our teeth in there. And I know that diet, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but higher protein, higher fats, higher cholesterols can help with testosterone levels, right?
Yeah, we did a study a few years ago, and the compared to a Western diet, a ketogenic diet was slightly higher. Participants had a little bit higher testosterone levels, and that could have been due to, participants previously following a low-fat diet, which would restrict the precursors like cholesterol that are used to synthesize your hormones, like testosterone. So we saw a little bump up. If you calorie restrict, if you fast, I noticed that my testosterone goes down. 5 days to 7 days of fasting will crush my testosterone. Although I've experimented with different lengths of fasting, and 3 days seems to be the sweet spot for me, in that I get a pretty profound suppression of the hormone insulin, lowering of blood glucose, and elevation of ketones to a glucose. Tom Seyfried may have talked about the glucose ketone index. And if you get that to 1, that's equal millimolar concentrations of glucose and ketones in your bloodstream. And when you achieve that, that is remarkably neuroprotective, anti-seizure, and anti-cancer. So it takes really about 3 days of fasting to achieve that. So we're sort of working on ways to achieve that faster and more efficiently. But once that, at 3 days, my testosterone levels does not suppress too much. But getting back to your question, eating a ketogenic diet and sustaining it has really not altered my testosterone in any way, up or down, really. I mean, I've been doing it for over 10 years, and I could see I'm always at the midpoint of testosterone. It's not high, it's not low. I'm approaching 50, so I'm not on any kind of testosterone replacement therapy or anything like that. But I know that as people age, their testosterone goes down with age, and mine has not done that. And I don't know if it's because of the diet or what. I do supplement with DHEA, though. I take a small dose with breakfast in the morning, and that might bump my testosterone up a little bit.
Yeah, and lifting weights can help too, right?
I do think, yeah, that's a good question, and I'm kind of interested in that. When you do lift weights, and you lift weights at a certain level of intensity, you do get it's a physiological stress response that will increase cortisol and also temporarily increase testosterone, and then that could have a potential anabolic effect. Although it doesn't, what I noticed, and I've measured testosterone in the morning, my testosterone is kind of trending on the low end of normal at the end of the day, although you're supposed to measure it in the morning. And if I measure it first thing in the morning, then it's usually always, I don't know, it's been as low as like 350 or 400, but usually around and it varies. I think it's important, if you get one testosterone measurement and it's low, don't panic. I would encourage measuring it at least 3 times when you're normal and not under stress, or, not pushing your body too hard. But in the morning, I'm about 30 to 50% higher than if I do a blood draw or a saliva hormone test, at 5 or 6 in the evening. So that's important. If you are monitoring your testosterone, mine peaks in the morning. I think that's pretty common.
Now, a common question I get a lot, I know these are probably things you've talked about a billion times, but the common question when you do any type of diet similar to this is, well, what about my cholesterol? What about, consuming so much fat? What if I'm a diabetic or I'm pre-diabetic? I'm sure you get those questions a lot too. Are there concerns for people who, maybe have high cholesterol, maybe they have issues with diabetes being in their family and worrying about it being hereditary? Going to a diet where they completely cut out sugar, would it be a danger? Would there be a risk that they should be concerned about?
Mm-hmm. I do get that question asked a lot, and my opinion in response to that question has changed over the years, from 10 years ago to now. As more data emerges, I'll say this up front, that it is, and I probably said it maybe in podcasts years ago, that the lipid changes associated with the ketogenic diet are not atherogenic and are not something to be concerned about, and happen only in a small subset population. But my opinion has changed on that. My LDL has went up really high, my LP little a, my ApoB, these things trend on the high end of normal. I've been able to maintain a ketogenic diet and bring them down primarily by lowering saturated fat. So we have known for years, and I know you had Dr. Lustig on, and he might have talked about this too. And saturated fat is the main driver of an elevation of LDL, and the large majority of doctors will quickly prescribe a statin when they see LDL, get even a little bit high, which is unfortunate. But if your LDL is astronomically high, then that may warrant a statin. Or if you have hypercholesterolemia in your family, under some conditions, you may want to, at the very last resort, use a statin. But my opinion is that if you're following a ketogenic diet and you have changes in biomarkers in your lipids, if your triglycerides are elevated, that's a bad sign. That means that your body's not really adapting to burning fat. And there are different things that you can do. You could do, if you're getting a eucaloric amount of calories, which means your body weight is not changing up or down in any way, and then you see pretty high increases in triglycerides, that's not a good sign. And I've looked at blood work where the ketogenic diet is just not good for that person. So they could do low carb, they could do high protein, moderate fat, low carbohydrate, higher fiber, and that tends to work more for them. But I'm trying to think of my LDL numbers and ApoB, but I did an NMR lipid profile a couple of times, and eating a high amount of meat, eating a high amount of dairy fat, and including coconut oil, actually, really skyrocketed my LDL. And I was able to bring that down just by incorporating more monounsaturated fats. And that could be egg yolks, really did not have too much. So I eat a lot of fish, a lot of eggs. Nuts don't agree with me all that well, but I know for people that can tolerate them, they're great. Olive oil, ton of olive oil. But yeah, I did an experiment where I did carnivore. I know you had Chris Bell on, and Chris and Mark Bell advocating the carnivore diet. I had a podcast with Sean Baker and have another one coming up. And I felt great on the carnivore diet, and I did it for a couple of weeks and got full blood work, including an NMR lipid profile, and my LDL was higher than I'd ever seen it. I may have been in a slight caloric surplus because I was eating a lot of ribeye steaks and just a lot of fat, animal fat. And the thing that bothered me the most was my HDL went down a little bit and my triglycerides went up from like 45 to like 75 or 85. So that's pretty high for me. And then I switched back to my version of the ketogenic diet, which is pretty heavy on fish. It's got quite a bit of vegetables, at least one big salad a day, cruciferous vegetables like broccoli and I get asparagus and cauliflower and things like that. And then all those numbers like normalized, went back to what is normal for me, which is trending high, but still within the normal range. Though my doctor thinks it's outside the normal range, but for me, I think it's normal following a ketogenic diet. We still don't have good data to indicate what is normal LDL and lipid profile in those following a ketogenic diet, which I will admit is a pretty restrictive. In the world of epilepsy, a ketogenic diet is not thought of as being healthy. It's thought of as a medical therapy that involves close, tight supervision over time. So that's the world where I come from. It's not, and I remember presenting at a conference, maybe my first conference years ago, where I mentioned during my talk that I was on a ketogenic diet. People came up to me after and they're like, "Oh, we didn't know you had epilepsy," and it was at sort of a mainstream epilepsy. It's like, no, I've been following. Actually, at the time, I had transitioned from a classical ketogenic diet that Charlie Abrams had followed, and then Dr. Eric Kossoff, and I think working with John Freeman, but the late John Freeman, but also with Mackenzie Cervenka at Johns Hopkins, they utilize a modified Atkins or a modified ketogenic diet, which is quite a bit higher in protein, almost double the amount of protein, a little bit less fat, and a little bit, it's more liberal. And I had transitioned to that. And that was definitely a better diet to follow if you're into working out and fitness and strength training and things like that. And then I saw favorable changes in my lipid profile, following that. And I think switching out some of the foods was also really important, which altered the fatty acid ratios was important. And my response may be atypical, but it seems to be typical, at least in the people that I communicate with.
Well, I had Rob Wolf on recently, and we talked about how people who have heart attacks have average cholesterol levels. So there is some concern about maybe a overreaction to those numbers.
Yeah, for sure. I think, we need to pay attention to things like blood pressure. I measure blood pressure a couple times a day. Actually, right now I'm doing some like sauna therapy or heat therapy in the hot tub and elevating my body temperature and looking at effects of like heat and cold. And a big effect that I get with the ketogenic diet was a pretty big drop in blood pressure. And that's primarily due to the water weight loss. Your plasma volume may go down a little bit because it has a diuretic and a natriuretic effect, which you lose a little bit of sodium. That's why it's important to get electrolytes in. You mentioned Rob Wolf. I do use his product, Element, as electrolytes are important. I also use a product, a ketone salt product, which gives the same electrolytes and they're bound to ketones. So KETO starts the name of that product. And I do really believe that electrolytes are important and blood pressure tends to go down. And that's a huge benefit of the ketogenic diet, I think. But you're right in regards to, I'm not fully convinced that LDL is atherogenic in a lot of people. And you're right, a lot of people have heart attacks with normal cholesterol.
Yeah, because that's always, that's like one of the most common things, because people immediately assume if you're eating all those fats, cholesterol levels are going to go up. Doctor's going to say you're unhealthy. So but I'm always a little skeptical of that stuff anyways. I've always been a little skeptical of pharmaceutical companies and why they pick specific numbers to start suggesting products. There's a Australian journalist, I remember she dove deep into this whole thing and how do they achieve that number, that when they start recommending this stuff. So that's fascinating. One thing that it's been a life changer for me was joint pain. Mm-hmm. Much like Mark Sisson, he assumed all his joint pain came from training. I've spent hours and hours of beating up my joints in the gym or on the basketball court. So I just assumed that's why my joints hurt. And then when I started eliminating glucose and sugar from my diet, I realized like, holy crap, like it was all the inflammation that foods I was eating caused. Besides joint pain, what other possible health benefits would you get from removing those things from your diet?
Yeah, our metabolic health is intimately tied to inflammatory state, for sure. So we look at inflammation in the study we're doing now. We are doing a clinical trial, a registered clinical trial using continuous glucose monitoring. And we're looking at a full array of cytokines and chemokines, and including things like hsCRP, which I think is actually a really good indicator of systemic inflammation. Inflammation is a driver of neurological diseases for sure. Inflammation is a driver for leaky gut, and Rob Wolf may have talked about that. Huge driver. We do studies using LPS, lipopolysaccharide, and a tiny bit of LPS radically causes a huge burst in inflammation, but also it affects things like the tight junctions in your gut, which will then allow things to enter circulation. Your gut serves a really important barrier function. And inflammation caused by diet, and that could be sugar, wheat, different processed carbohydrates tend to do this more. And, there are different theories why it's doing that. It could be just an allergic response to the different proteins and carbohydrates sources like wheat. It could be an allergy thing, or it could just be a sugar thing too. And just you're feeding the gut high amounts of processed food and sugar, you can get what some people term small intestinal bacterial overgrowth, or SIBO. And that can influence the gut flora in a way that produces a pro-inflammatory effect on the gut and influences the tight junctions, which are really serve an important barrier function in the gut. But we also have tight junctions in the blood-brain barrier. So, and that's why there's this gut-brain axis. If we are living in an inflammatory state, we likely have leaky gut. I think you can make that. I mean, there's different tests to look at this, and that's sort of the next study we want to do. And but if you have leaky gut, you also have a leaky brain. So the blood-brain barrier has these tight junctions, and then systemic inflammation also contributes to neuroinflammation. And I think that's an important concept that only a few people are really talking about. Like Dr. David Perlmutter was one. Maybe Dr. Lustig was talking about it too. And we do see that carbohydrate restriction, just weight loss, calorie restriction, fasting, carbohydrate restriction, anything that kind of normalizes and reduces blood glucose and insulin, increases insulin sensitivity, and improves certain metabolic biomarkers, lowers inflammation. And there was a researcher at Yale, Dr. Dixit, that published a Nature Medicine paper, and he had done quite a bit of work on fasting and inflammatory mediators, or the suppression of inflammation with fasting, and well-published, high-impact journals on that. And he had reached out to me years ago and wanted to put together a diet, because when he did metabolomics on the mice that were fasted, the one analyte or metabolite that was really elevated was beta-hydroxybutyrate and acetoacetate, these ketone molecules. So he reached out to me, and I helped formulate a diet that he used in his study, and it was later published in Nature Medicine, showing that elevating ketones with a ketone supplement reduce the activation of the NLRP3 inflammasome. And when that complex gets activated, or it has to get primed and then it gets activated, and beta-hydroxybutyrate influences both of those processes. But once it's activated, you have a burst in inflammatory cytokines, including IL-1 beta and others. And then these can go on and wreak havoc in the body. So, it was kind of a small step forward. I'm sure there's other things that play a role here, but we do know that one of the anti-inflammatory effects of a ketogenic diet could be just suppressing inflammasome complexes that are pathophysiologically linked to the activation of pro-inflammatory cytokines. So that's really at the center of what we're doing. And our work right now, he's more interested in sort of insulin sensitivity and the immune regulation, which I think is a very important topic now with things like COVID. But we're interested in using a ketogenic diet and ketone supplementation to reduce inflammation, especially neuroinflammation, because we think that neuroinflammation is a trigger for certain types of seizures. So we're doing studies now with lipopolysaccharide, LPS, which is a strong inducer of certain types of seizures. And we find that ketone therapy can help suppress those seizures. And it doesn't have to be a grand mal seizure. It could be like what's called an absence seizure, where you're having a seizure and just kind of staring off into the, and not actually convulsing. So we're looking at different seizure types and how the therapies may apply there. But you could also make the argument that if you're reducing neuroinflammation, you're reducing the accumulation of toxic plaques like tau and amyloid beta, which are drivers for not only Alzheimer's disease and Parkinson's and other neuropathologies, but also things like if you have traumatic brain injury, that causes profound neuroinflammation, and mitigating that would be really important. So, so some of the work that we're doing and work with others is sort of developing comprehensive metabolic therapies that can reduce neuroinflammation associated with brain injury.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. Yeah, Dr. Thomas Seyfried, his work was fascinating because what he said is so true. Like, we all know that glucose is the energy source for cancer cells. My wife has family members that have passed away from cancer. One of my good friends who's younger than I am was diagnosed with cancer. I asked him, I'm like, did your doctor mention anything about your diet? And he's like, yeah, you should stay away from red meat. And I'm like, I'm like, where is he getting? I actually asked him, like, where is he getting that information? Because I'm just curious. Maybe there's something out there I'm not aware of. But there's no conversation about just the benefits of removing carbs and sugars, or even just processed foods. I mean, that's one of the things that a lot of these diets that work for people have in common, is that it's kind of not so much what you're eating as much as what you're not eating, I think, is why people get a lot of positive effects on different diets. You're eating probably more whole foods and you're eating cleaner. It just seems like so much of the research, by the time it gets published and it gets to a doctor who is recommending it to a patient, it's like they're so behind, right?
Yeah, it's an important topic you bring up with red meat, right? Because there are, and it's probably that his oncologist is probably thinking about and referencing epidemiological data. So epidemiological studies and data are not research studies, really. They're not. It's not hard science, and there are many confounding factors. But red meat overconsumption, especially with other things, may lead to molecules, depending on how you prepare and your source of red meat, like heterocyclic amines and things like that, that could have carcinogenic potential. And I am of the opinion that, and this contrasts the carnivore perspective, is that whenever I have red meat, I usually have like a salad with it, vegetable, things like that, with high phytonutrient content that could potentially offset the negative effects from some of the things like heterocyclic amines and other potentially carcinogenic things that arise from red meat. But I'm also picky about my red meat sources. And but I really do think it's kind of the overconsumption of food, insulin resistance, sustained systemic inflammation. These things are drivers. And it's true, we use a fluorodeoxyglucose PET scan, an FDG PET scan, to image the location and aggressiveness of tumors, where they're at and how aggressive they are. That's the gold standard. PET scan is used to image that. But historically, we have not use that information to target the cancer, which is, oncologists all agree that a PET scan is a gold standard, and it's detecting glucose consumption, which could be dozens, if not 100 times higher in cancer cells. So you would think that, glucose is a ubiquitous energy source throughout the body. So potentially targeting it or eliminating glucose transport would be toxic, right? And one way to do that is with a drug called 2-deoxyglucose. There's also 3-bromopyruvate. There's lonidamine. These inhibit hexokinase, and hexokinase 2 specifically is upregulated in cancer cells. And that endows them with the ability to suck up massive amounts of glucose for not only energy, but also for biosynthetic processes. So the expanding biomass of the tumor requires large amounts of glucose and glutamine to do things like make nucleic acids and lipids. Even like glutamine will go into a lipid pathway for membrane and things like that. And also high glucose consumption is used by the cancer cells to fuel the pentose phosphate pathway. So the pentose phosphate pathway is required for the cancer cells to make high levels of endogenous antioxidant systems like glutathione. So cancer cells are sucking up massive amounts of glucose, not just for energy, but for biosynthetic processes and for endogenous antioxidant capacity. So restricting a ketogenic diet does three things in my mind that are super important. And we talk about glucose a lot, but I think the main thing that's putting the brakes on cancer growth is suppression of insulin and insulin signaling. So insulin, IGF-1, mTOR, that whole pathway. That's why PI3 kinase inhibitors are being used now. Interestingly, a PI3 kinase inhibitor will induce a counter-regulatory effect and actually increase insulin. So that becomes problematic. But PI3 kinase inhibitors work remarkably well in the context of a ketogenic diet that will suppress insulin. So the ketogenic diet suppresses insulin and insulin signaling. It reduces glucose availability to the tumor, and it also elevates and sustains ketones. And ketones are not a good source for cancer cell fuel metabolism. So as Thomas Seyfried probably went into, he was the first one to bring to my attention that cancer cells have defective mitochondria. And there are some people who view the mitochondrial abnormalities in cancer cells not as a defect, but as a consequence of deranged energy metabolism that changes the ability of the cancer cell to direct metabolites to biosynthesis pathways. So, and I believe that's a factor too. So I personally think cancer is a metabolic disease and a genetic disease, and it's intertwined, and it depends highly on the tumor type. And so there's a lot of nuance here that can be talked about, sort of above and beyond a podcast conversation. But the important thing is that a ketogenic diet suppresses insulin and insulin signaling, and that will, by virtue of suppressing insulin and insulin signaling, that will dramatically reduce glycolysis. Because insulin, if you inject insulin to your body, that dramatically increases glycolysis, which is the burning of sugar for fuel, and it translocates the glucose transporter to the membrane, so your cells can suck in more glucose. It activates glycolytic enzymes. So a ketogenic diet, the macronutrient ratio of a ketogenic diet will suppress dramatically insulin. And then you have limited glucose availability on top of an elevation of ketones. And an elevation of ketones are hormone-like metabolites that have antioxidant effects. They have anti-cancer effects, anti-inflammatory effects. They can, we think, actually inhibit hexokinase. And cancer cells, if you're growing cancer cells with glucose and ketones, the addition of ketones will decrease the proliferation and also increase dead cells, the number of dead cells. And in some cancer cell lines, if you subtract the glucose and just grow them only in the presence of ketones, all the cancer cells die. So, and that's indicative of cancer cells, not being able to have metabolic flexibility to adapt from using glucose to using ketones as an energy source. So these cell studies I was tinkering with before I actually began doing quote unquote like sponsored cancer research got me very intrigued with this idea. I had some medical students and later graduate students who were growing different cancer cell lines, and we were manipulating glucose and ketones. And it was very clear to me that, glucose caused explosive cancer growth, and the addition of ketones suppressed that even in the presence of high glucose. So this was super important to us. We actually presented it at a number of different early meetings. And then that actually became the motivation for my first PhD student that I ever mentored, who's now Dr. Angela Poff. And her project was looking at the ketogenic diet with a combination of hyperbaric oxygen therapy. So hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a whole another topic we can get into. But hyperbaric oxygen therapy in and of itself is not very, it's not very powerful anti-cancer, but when in the context of a ketogenic diet in our model system, which was a good model system, in other model systems, it seems to be remarkably effective. So, and then later on, we added ketone supplementation to further reduce blood glucose and elevate ketones, and saw a triple benefit of this non-toxic cancer approach, which was a specifically engineered ketogenic diet that was higher in omega-3s. And we switched out like the lard for with MCT oil. So it was a ketogenic diet that was a little bit higher in protein, like 20, maybe 25% protein. And then we had higher omega-3s, which I think are important too. And then a large percentage of the fat source was medium chain triglyceride oil, or MCTs. So when we administered this ketogenic diet, we saw much higher levels of ketones than other ketogenic diets that researchers were using in rodent models. Because everyone was telling me, oh, it's so hard to get, rodents, mice and rats into a state of ketosis. But with this modified diet, we were able to do that. And then when we added hyperbaric oxygen therapy, 2.5 atmospheres of oxygen given 3 times a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, we saw pretty remarkable effects at reducing tumor growth and extending the life of the mice that have this like super aggressive metastatic cancer. It was a model system that Dr. Seifert actually developed at Boston. And I remember I reached out to him and I was like, Tom, I want to use your glioblastoma model. I want to use specifically your brain tumor model. And he wasn't supportive of me using the brain tumor model. He's like, no, I got this new model and it causes rapid systemic metastasis. It kills mice faster than any other model system. And, you know, if we transfer these mice to you and you set up the protocol and you test this idea and it works, then we know we're on to something. So we did all the paperwork and got the mice transferred and the cells and this very unique cell line and everything. And then it took a while to get it up and going, but we just saw some remarkable results. I remember just driving into the lab every morning, like super early, just to see like what happened with the mice, you know, and just that was back in the day where I was like in the trenches, actually, with my graduate students running experiments and doing the actual measurements and stuff now. And I try to do that sometimes, but it was Tom Seifert that really put the fire in us to look at metabolic therapies in cancer.
Yeah, it's a why do you think things like, you know, chemo and radiation are still the go-to protocols when there are other, I mean, that's why I constantly repeat Jim Abrams' story on this podcast, because I think it's such an important story, how he, you know, and he said it himself, he was this was at the height of his career. He had all the resources that he needed to try to get his son help. All the doctors were basically recommending, you know, I think that he had what he looks back at now as a unnecessary surgery. His son had an unnecessary surgery to try to help with these seizures. He was put on all these prescription drugs. Not one doctor brought up the ketogenic diet, even though I think he found the study that John Hopkins was a part of initially in some book, and that's what sparked his interest into it. So they did look into it until eventually I think prescription drugs end up being the road that they went down. But I mean, why do you think this type of stuff isn't even discussed? Why do you think there's still doctors out there, like my buddy's doctor, who says, hey, just stay away from red meat?
Yeah, good point you bring up. I got a lot of thoughts going through my head, but this is the book that he was sort of referencing. So a very, very early version of this book for your listeners or viewers out there, or if you can't see it, it's Ketogenic Diet Therapies for Epilepsy and Other Conditions. So the original, you know, copy by Dr. John Freeman, and he passed away in 2012, and then later Dr. Eric Kossoff, who really is kind of steering the ship, and Mackenzie Cervenka, actually in a virtual meeting with Dr. Kossoff, is presenting tonight at the meeting on ketogenic diets. So this book, Ketogenic Diet Therapies, Dr. Eric Kossoff is the first author there, really inspired me. And that was the original diet that I followed, which was for pediatric epilepsy. And then they published it in adults and showed that the diet was effective for adults with epilepsy. You would think that would be the case anyway, but they had to do the science to support it. And now the book actually covers cancer and other conditions. So what I come to find out is that Jim Abrams' son, Charlie, that it was not an uncommon thing that many people that I conversed with were having problems with epilepsy drugs. They just did not work. You know, 1/3 of them just are completely refractory. And then I connected with a patient, Mike Dancer, who later became a great friend of mine, and he's over in the UK. He was into working out and bodybuilding, and he had a severe epilepsy, what you would term, his doctors term terminal epilepsy. And I made this suggestion to him after learning about his story, and then he was going to have brain surgery, just like Charlie Abrams was going to have. And he, you know, I think I recommended, hey, try GABA, try this or that. Nothing really worked. And then I gave him, you know, the idea of using the ketogenic diet. And then we didn't communicate for a while. But then, a few weeks or months later, he had said, "Oh yeah, I'm trying the diet. I'm doing it now, and I have not had a seizure," which was like crazy because he was having multiple seizures per week. Long story short, Mike became sort of the spokesperson for the ketogenic diet in adults for epilepsy, and he is networked with Matthew's Friends. So Matthew's Friends in Europe is kind of like the Charlie Foundation here. And you could find Mike Dancer on the website. I'm sure if you Google Mike Dancer and epilepsy, it'll have his story and how he actually used the diet for like bodybuilding purposes in addition to that. And, he's not seizure free, but it changed his life, and he believes that it saved his life. And I do too. And his doctors are just his doctors were adamantly opposed against him doing this, especially stopping all medication, which Mike did because he had tremendous side effects from the medication, as did Charlie Abrams. So he was able to stop the medication, multiple anti-seizure drugs, cold turkey, and start the ketogenic diet, and he had remarkable seizure control. And now, so this became the basis of my TEDx talk, which was like 10 years ago now. My I had never met him, but we were emailing like pretty much constantly. And then I heard Jim Abrams' story, and then I talked to him, and I was like, "Jim, can I incorporate your story into my TEDx talk?" And then all these people I communicated with and was like suggesting the diet and Eric Kossoff's book, and they're implementing it properly. I'll have to add that the people who did implement it properly were the ones getting, the beneficial effects. And there are right ways to implement a ketogenic diet and wrong ways. And at the time, I really thought about it as a medical therapy, and you need guidance for this therapy. If you're going to use it to metabolically manage a chronic disorder like cancer, epilepsy, and things like that, or metabolic diseases. And another group I connected with was the glucose transporter type 1 deficiency syndrome group. That's a mouthful. But I connected with parents and kids that had this and saw that the ketogenic diet was also life-saving. And it is actually the standard of care for GLUT1D, for pyruvate dehydrogenase complex deficiency, and other metabolic disorders. So I saw that a diet could literally revive someone and save their life. And that became, I'm in a pharmacology department, so and I was going up for tenure. It looked like academic suicide, but I knew this worked. And I knew that if you studied something that worked, and we could advance the science to human application, you're helping people, that people would take notice and listen, and then ultimately the funding would come. So I just we dug in our heels, and my students were in the trenches doing experiments, and we just kept publishing and getting, doing science, and things just kind of spearheaded in different directions from there.
Yeah, well, it's fascinating because you don't mind looking at things outside the box or exploring people who are looking at things outside the box, which I think we need more of. We have issues with that where, like you said, because your doctor's not recommending it, you assume it might not be true, or it's not scientific, or that solution might not exist. And I think that's a huge issue with modern medicine. We also only look at prescription drugs. It's symptom management, obviously. And I mean, even during the whole COVID thing, and I told myself I'm going to try to not have another COVID heavy podcast, but obviously it's a huge topic. And I'll try not to get you in trouble because I've also had Dr. Peter McCullough and Dr. Robert Malone on the show before Joe Rogan.
Oh, that's great. Yeah.
It boggles my mind that we haven't had 2 years or 2.5 years or 3 years of telling people who are high risk, regardless, how dangerous people feel the virus is. If you're really concerned, those people who are high risk, and there's evidence to show that if you're obese, you're more likely to be harmed by the virus. You could literally take somebody who's high risk in these last 2 years and make them low risk just by talking and discussing the things that we're discussing now, talking about how to change your diet, talking about, the benefits of eating well. And yet there's like no conversation about it. One thing that I find very fascinating about you're very similar to Dr. Jessica Rose, very intelligent girl, but she's also a professional surfer. So she implements the stuff that she talks about. Like, as you know, you lift weights. your body becomes your experiment. Joe Rogan, that's what makes him fascinating. Lane Norton, I know you had that debate with him. He's very intelligent, but he also implements that stuff, even though I don't agree with everything he says or does. But I find those people more fascinating because people who lift weights, who exercise, people who are athletes, they don't just talk about the science and talk about what the body is capable of. They actually implement it. And a lot of times their body becomes the best experiment because you can change your diet, see how you react, because you see it over and over again. Professional athletes get a doctor would call a career-ending injury, and then they recover from it, and they're back playing at Division I college or professionals again. And it's almost like there's a disconnect between, almost like they don't understand, or they're naive to the fact that the human body is absolutely amazing if you give it the tools and the nutrition and the physical and maybe dietary therapies it may need for it to recover. Sorry.
Yeah, there's kind of a lot to unpack there.
I was just going to say that I gave you a lot.
I'll say, yeah, your metabolic physiology is incredibly adaptable. And that's an important concept. So and that's why we're omnivores, and that's why we survive. So we could radically shift our fuel source, to a ketogenic diet, and not only our metabolic physiology, but our skeletal muscle system can also adapt to different fuel sources, and our nervous system is also incredibly adaptable. Can be favorably to the right stimulus, and interestingly, like, the stimulus of exercise produces many what look to be negative consequences as far as inflammation, reactive oxygen species, mitochondrial stress, and things like that acutely. But it's the adaptation to that stimulus that then produces favorable effects, benefits. And I think the same thing is happening with the ketogenic diet. So initially, it's hard to do, it's hard to maintain, but you are shifting metabolic physiology, which actually changes and shifts brain metabolism, but also brain pharmacology. So you're changing and almost in many ways like rewiring the network in your brain, because GABA levels go up, glutamate comes down. We're looking at adenosine, blood flow changes pretty profoundly. Maybe that's an adenosine effect. Reactive oxygen species go down, inflammation goes down. So there's a lot of synergistic things. Like, the ketogenic diet is not one mechanism, and I think doctors are used to prescribing a drug that hits like one mechanism, like vigabatrin, for example, or the anti-epileptic drugs work through specific mechanisms, whereas the ketogenic diet works through multiple mechanisms in synergy. And that's why the ketogenic diet works when drugs fail, because you could have a drug that's actually working through a GABAergic mechanism that the patient becomes refractory, but uses the ketogenic diet and then gets seizure control. So there's multiple mechanisms working in synergy to restore brain homeostasis and suppress seizures. And that's a big thrust of the basic science research that's being done now, because people are racing to get a ketogenic diet in a pill. This has always been the case ever since I've been researching the ketogenic diet. I was given invitations. I won't mention the pharmaceutical companies, but I was given invitations to numerous pharmaceutical companies where I would go there. And then, at the end of my talk, I would say, well, it's not one mechanism you got, you'll need to target. There's all these mechanisms, and showing dozens of different mechanisms and the associated publications that support, all these different mechanisms. And that's the nature of metabolism. Metabolism is incredibly complex. And when you change your metabolic physiology, that has an enormous effect on what your brain eats, right? So, you're changing literally the metabolites in your blood, and that's feeding your brain. And, but it's also doing so many other things. Like we mentioned, ketones are an endogenous metabolite that also functions as a hormone and activates epigenetic pathways. So one of the projects we're working on now, and it's becoming a PhD dissertation for my current student, is actually looking at the epigenetic effects of ketones. Beta hydroxybutyrate we think that it's actually directly interacting with the histone and influencing gene transcription through direct interaction of the histone in a process called beta hydroxybutyrylation, or BHB-lation, we call it. So, and we're specifically looking at this in the context of a rare genetic disorder called Kabuki syndrome, where we know, what gene is and things like that. And we have Kabuki syndrome mice we're looking at. So this is something that I would have never, ever thought about, 10 years ago when I got into this research, that an elevation of a metabolite is actually influencing epigenetic regulation, not only through histone deacetylase inhibition, so it can affect various enzyme systems that play a role in sort of activating different genes, right? But beta hydroxybutyrate could be directly interacting with histones in a way that turn on or turn off different genes. So we're investigating that now as part of a project. We're studying Kabuki syndrome. So I think there's this kind of research is very nascent. It's emerging research, and you can't go to a human clinical trial. There's not a whole lot of human clinical trials. So with the ketogenic diet and cancer, I don't even think there was one back in when I started studying this, but now there's about 40 ketogenic diet registered clinical trials. It's not even including the ones that are not registered on clinicaltrials.gov. And if you just go and Google ketone supplement into clinicaltrials.gov, you get dozens of clinical trials that are actually using ketone supplements. There's much more with the ketogenic diet, but it's this idea that we are making progress. The basic science research, the science is moving to human clinical application. So we're in a very exciting time, but it's going to take quite a long time for these trials to be completed, for the results to be published, and to gain general acceptance. Tonight, I'm actually, I teach a part of a course, scholarly concentration in nutrition, to the medical college at USF Morsani College of Medicine. Nutrition is not really part of the curriculum, but then they have a separate course called scholarly concentration nutrition. And we're talking about supplements, right? So everybody will be talking about a different supplement. And it was brought to my attention that one of the teaching faculty should talk about a supplement too. So I was like, okay, maybe I should pick something. So I just have a very short time frame, but creatine monohydrate is very interesting to me because back in the 90s, I remember putting it on my exercise physiology exam and basically getting a big X through the paper saying that, there's no science to support this. And I didn't get points for that particular short answer question of ergogenic aids. You had to list ergogenic aids. And I firmly stated the rationale. But now if you go to like examine.com, for example, and there's like something like hundreds, like 700 trials, 700 research studies on creatine, not only for exercise performance, but also for neurological health. And so I think of ketones, if we think of a supplement, ketones is kind of like the next creatine. So, we have done a lot of, I'm a big fan of the ketogenic diet and versions of the ketogenic diet that could be sort of changed to be a lifestyle diet, which I do myself, admittedly. And then I'm also a big fan of increasing and furthering the research on ketone supplements, because I do think these supplements hold potential similar to creatine. So we consume creatine. It's like similar to ketones. It's produced endogenously, or, it's found in food, and it becomes, it enhances energy production, ATP, at the level of the cell. And for restoring and producing, enhancing our bioenergetics of the cell. And ketones do the same thing. And this can have profound consequences for neurological health, but also there's quite a few studies on cardiovascular health. So the heart functions more efficiently off ketones as an energy source than glucose. So the late Dr. Richard Veitch, who was mentored by Hans Krebs and worked at the NIH and developed, he was really people think of me as like the keto king or whatever, but Dr. Richard Veitch was really sort of the first pioneer to leverage this idea of developing an exogenous ketone. And early on, I saw that he was funded by DARPA, and which became very interesting to me because it was in the Warfighter Performance program. And he was getting quite a lot of money to develop exogenous ketones for enhancing warfighter performance. So I became very interested in that because I was looking for an anti-seizure therapy that would not impair performance. So this idea of developing exogenous ketones that could not only prevent seizures, but also enhance performance at the same time. Like my mouth was watering, So I would be, emailing Dr. Veach, calling Dr. Veach. We had different opinions on different things. And then him and many other people were instrumental in steering my career to sort of develop and to really delve into the science. Like there are things that ketones do, and they undoubtedly get oversold by companies trying to sell their products, saying that it's a panacea for everything, that, they're making claims about weight loss and things like that. The data is just not there, but there is data, in animal models, and then now data is being collected in human studies. But it gives a bad image to the world of ketogenic diets and the whole keto movement. I'm excited and thrilled that it went mainstream in the short amount of time I've been studying this, but at the same time, it has brought negative attention to those who are advocating a ketogenic diet because of some of the things that people are claiming. And I think I'm at a happy medium where I'm someone who's advocating for it outside of the world of a medical therapy as more of a lifestyle approach. But at the same time, I keep one foot firmly planted in the world of ketogenic medical therapies. And that's why I'm a co-host for the Metabolic Health Summit, which is bringing people from, Harvard and Stanford and Yale and Duke and all these major universities that are clinical scientists, basic science researchers, but also we like to provide a venue where companies can come. So there's a lot of entrepreneurs scrambling to this area, and some of them have very interesting products that they're bringing to market. And these products, including biowearables and ketone monitoring systems and apps, make these products are very exciting to those in the clinical world because they could use various ketogenic snacks for kids, because many times kids feel ostracized that they can't eat a brownie, for example. But if you have a company making a legitimate ketogenic brownie, and very few are, but if you can identify the ones using it by wearing like a continuous glucose monitor, which I do, and measuring ketones, then you can vet out and identify the useful technologies that are coming to the space, and then we can steer them into clinical application, which is a big part of what we're doing at Metabolic Health Summit too.
Now, I know you're probably limited on time now. You're a very busy guy. But one thing I did want to hit on, as somebody like myself who, like you, I'm a gym rat, and then I play basketball or soccer or both multiple times a week. I do it fasting. I say I do it fasting, but I do take a pre-workout. Sometimes I actually take a Norton's pre-workout Outworked, which is actually a pretty good pre-workout, besides the fact that it has glucose, I think, in it. I mean, that's one of the things I look for immediately. I'm like, how much attention to detail do they put in their product? And then when you see glucose, it's like, really? Come on, you can't put stevia or monk fruit or something that's a little better for you. Do you take any pre-workouts? Do you take, I know back in the day when we talked, you talked about taking creatine. That's one of the few things that I do consistently take also is creatine. What supplements do you take? You also talked about Element, Rob Wolf's product, which I take. Some people, I think the keto flu could be because of that. If you go long periods of time without eating, you're not getting any potassium or calcium or any of the sodium electrolytes. So then it's hard to kind of stay hydrated, I think. I think that could be a contributor to what people call a keto flu. But would those products take you out of fasting? Would a electrolyte product or a pre-workout product take you out of fasting or take you out of ketosis, and you would lose some of those benefits? Or should you stay away from them at all if you're really concerned about getting the benefits of ketosis or fasting?
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd like to kind of go back to the beginning of the question. Also a lot to unpack there. I use about 5 or 6 supplements that I'll quickly recommend, or not recommend, or just mention. But sugar is actually I think of sugar as a performance enhancing substance. So sugar used correctly can really enhance performance. So it does not surprise me that Lane Norton put that into his product. And I think in the context, depending on where you're coming from, a little bit of sugar during a workout can go a long way. Like 20 grams of sugar could be very anti-catabolic. And it depends on what kind of diet you're following. So the people, a lot of the people interested in the ketogenic diet are the very people who don't necessarily need it, right? They don't a lot of athletes are interested in it, but then they also recognize that if they adhere to a ketogenic diet, they can push their body to burning more fat, which is great from my perspective. I don't get hungry. I have steady fuel flow. I'm doing the ketogenic diet primarily for the cognitive benefits, the resilience. I get more work done. I'm more productive. I feel better. My biomarkers have improved in many ways. So I feel better going into a workout fasted if I'm doing something like deadlifts. But if I have, a food in my stomach and going into certain movements like squats or deadlifts, it seems to hurt my performance. Whereas if I'm going to like bench press or something like that, and I'll consume a lot of liquid and electrolytes and sometimes a meal, and then I can, I feel fuller, my vascularity comes out, you can see visually this effect. And there may be some benefits there, but typically electrolytes are something that I use. So the supplements that I use are ketone supplements. I use one of the ketone salt product that I use is Keto Start, and it basically has an electrolyte ratio similar to Element. So you're delivering the same electrolytes, but those electrolytes are bound to beta hydroxybutyrate. So it's giving, the electrolytes and beta hydroxybutyrate. And then I like Element too. So sometimes I'll add Element to it for a little bit of extra boost. And, vitamin D, the typical things, a creatine monohydrate. With the ketogenic diet, a carnitine is really important. So I actually noticed a benefit in energy when I added carnitine. So carnitine tartrate, the muscles tend to use that a little more, but I've been using acetyl L-carnitine or acetyl L-carnitine, and it crosses the blood-brain barrier. And carnitine helps to transport fatty acids into the mitochondria. And kids that follow a ketogenic diet, we often see low carnitine levels, even though, they could be eating meat and sources rich of carnitine, because your body is burning so much fat, you are sort of depleting your carnitine. It's like almost an indication that you're like a super high fat burner if your carnitine levels are low. So carnitine can give you a boost in energy. For working out though, I don't use I'm not too much of a supplement guy. I'm more of a food guy. So taurine, creatine monohydrate, just cheap stuff, ketone supplements, the ketone salt supplements. I have access to ketone esters and pretty much anything. And I've tried them and I think they have legitimate medical applications. But I'm also, and this comes from a ketone researcher, I would not want to increase my ketones to 3 or 4 millimolar or 5 millimolar with a ketone ester. I wouldn't want to do that day in and day out. Similar to the same reasons I wouldn't want to increase my glucose, and spike my glucose up. For me, the sweet spot with ketones is just elevating it about 1 to 1.5 millimolar. I can feel the energy. And you're getting a lot of the benefits too from that. And since I'm already following a ketogenic diet, I'm already in a state of mild ketosis. So that little extra boost in ketones is really good mid part of the day. So when I finish with this podcast, I take a little bit of ketones in the morning, like 1/3 of a packet, and then I use the other 2/3 of a packet, usually about 2 p.m. or something like that, and that gives me another boost throughout the day, so that I can feel. And then it has no effect on insulin, it has no effect on glucose. It looks like I'm fasting. So biochemically, it looks like, and I would say that electrolytes do not break a fast. Calories can potentially break a fast, like from fat. Like if you consume fat, you're not seeing insulin or glucose move that much, but because you're giving your body calories. But the ketones, the calories in like a ketone salt or electrolyte salt are very minimal. And there's really like no changes in metabolic physiology. So I think you're getting a lot of the benefits of fasting if you consume a ketone supplement. However, if I was to consume a ketone ester and the cutoff point is 2 millimolar. If you have a delta, if you increase your ketones an additional 2 millimolar with a ketone ester, and I measure, I take a blood measurement for insulin, then I can see insulin goes up. And for me, if I take something and I pop up to like 3 or 4 millimolar, I can get a pretty decent dump of insulin with a ketone ester. Whereas the ketone salts, it's like, even if I take 2 packets, then it's like just a tiny blip on insulin. So the ketone salts are a little bit safer. I also think when you deliver ketones with a ketone salt product, the electrolytes delay gastric absorption because your body has to make the solution isotonic once it gets into the duodenum. So it has to kind of give up and delays the absorption. Also, if you mix it with a little bit of MCT, the fat can delay absorption too. So it extends the pharmacokinetic curve to the right, if you will. So you get an elevation of ketones that's sustained for a longer period of time with a ketone electrolyte, just because the electrolytes have a delay in gastric absorption. If I just consume like a ketone monoester, just straight on it in a fasted state, it goes up and peaks in like 30 minutes. And then I go back down below baseline in 90 minutes. That's because your body is releasing insulin. And then that shuts off the endogenous ketogenic process. And I don't want to do that. So that's why I sparingly use ketones throughout the day for just like a burst and also to deliver electrolytes. And so I think you get the dual effect that the electrolytes have their own effect, and then the effect of, elevating your ketones. And then your body is still, if you're following a ketogenic diet, you're not impairing or inhibiting that endogenous ketogenic process.
So you do from time to time work out fasted without consuming any sugar, and does that have, you don't see a negative effect on your workouts? I mean, I do the same thing. I eat one meal a day at the end of the night with the wife and kids, and all day, if I play basketball, if I go to the gym, whatever I do it all on just caffeine and electrolyte products sometimes if I feel like I need it. But I'm always curious if maybe my performance is lagging. When you play sports, you sometimes you get to that point where you're just so fatigued. Maybe some of it's mental and you're trying to push yourself. And I'm always wondering, I'm like, okay, if I consume some type of sugar or carbs or something, would I be able to push myself a little harder or not get as fatigued? And I think last time we spoke, there wasn't many, but I think there are more athletes now that have experimented with the diet, right? So we do have some examples of possibly being able to perform at a high level on the diet.
Yeah. You've got guys like Zach Bitter, outperforming, people on carbohydrate-based diets. If you are a strength athlete, if you are in, doing exercise that's highly glycolytic, adding some carbohydrates back in could be good, but you don't need much. You just need like a little bit of carbohydrates in and around your training. And for me personally, I'm not looking to break any records or even personal records or whatever. So for me, my pre-workout is like a half packet of ketone salts and some creatine. And I also like taurine. Taurine actually helps the liver make more ketones too. So it has a kind of a nice effect. And I'm thinking, and then acetyl L-carnitine. So I will mix all that up in a shaker, half packet of keto start, maybe a little bit of element. And then I throw in like 2 or 3 grams of creatine with some taurine and acetyl L-carnitine, and then mix that up and drink it, and usually just right before I head to the barn. So I work out at home in our barn gym, and that's usually just my stack. And I feel it. I mean, I feel even if I take the non-caffeinated version of ketones, like I feel the boost there.
That's right, because I was going to ask you about caffeine, but I that's right, that product does have caffeine in it, right?
There's 2 keto. Let me see. The Keto Start Plus, the black one, has caffeine, and it's only like maybe 60 milligrams. I don't know. It's enough. You feel it. even though it's just 60 milligrams. And then the silver packet, the Keto Start, that's not the plus, is and surprisingly, that's the silver, the non-caffeinated one tends to be the one that's more sold out. But I like the caffeinated one because, it definitely, you can feel it. And ketones and caffeine are kind of synergistic. So there's some research on that. Actually, Jeff Bolick, I think, published a study showing a performance enhancing effect of ketone salts that also had caffeine in it. So no doubt in my mind, very few supplements like you can feel. Creatine is one, maybe acetyl L-carnitine. I like beta alanine too, but I don't like the prickly feeling I get on my skin with it. So I used that in the past. Way back in the day when I was my biggest and strongest, my pre-workout was a small bag of Doritos, like the little lunch things. I'd have a bag of Doritos and then branched chain amino acids. And I think it was the Civation made Extend. So I would just have that on my way to the gym. So the salt and the carbs would especially if you're in a fasted state, you'd be like crazy vascularity would increase. And, I would, if I wasn't following a ketogenic diet, I could do a low carb diet and just eat that little bag of Doritos, which was a lot of salt and just a little bit, maybe like 20 grams of carbs, with the sodium helping to transport. But, I'm not going to go back to processed food. I think once you adhere to a low carb lifestyle, and that's even ketogenic, you just experience the benefits throughout the day, and you're just so aware of your body more when you do intermittent fasting, when you really tweak your nutrition to optimize your brain health, how you feel, and how you feel cognitively is a very good litmus test for what's going on in your body. And I think that's really, a lot of people say, well, the ketogenic diet is great for cognitive and I feel more lucid and everything like that, but then my performance sort of declines. But there's a happy medium. I mean, if you feel like you have the best mental energy and you're more cognitive and lucid and you could have sustained energy throughout the day, that's a sign that your body is telling you that that's the ideal nutrition for you. So I think we have to, but it may not be optimal. For example, the gym rat who just wants to get as big as strong as possible. But I mean, I don't know. I'm still, I could still deadlift 600-700, I think, if I put my time into it. So it hasn't really hurt my strength that much, as long as I keep my protein adequate.
Yeah, because that is something that I constantly hear from people at the gym. They're like, oh, I can never do that because I need the carbs, I need this, and I need, it's like, well, do you? It's like maybe, and like you said, everybody's slightly different. I mean, that's the thing about diets. It does become a little religious where people get kind of tribalistic. A diet works well for them. It changes their life. How do you not get excited about telling people about that? I mean, I think that's where a lot of it comes from, is just, hey, this worked really well for me. I'm more productive. My joints don't hurt. I'm not hungry. Yeah, I want to tell people about that, just like I would tell people about anything that could help them. And you modify it, right? Because I mean, that's the other thing, like based on what your diet was previously, based on where you grew up, where you lived, all these type of things will affect the way your body reacts to a new diet also. So that's a big part of it too. It's not one size fits all. But like I said in the beginning of this, I think when you talk to a lot of people like yourself or Rob Wolf or Mark Bell, Chris Bell, there's some things that I think everybody kind of agrees on. When I had Dr. John Baker on the show, I did the diet for 2 weeks. I felt so good that I did it for another week. I did it for 3 weeks just because I'm like, wow, I actually like the way I look and I feel great. For me, it was just unsustainable. I love food too much that I'm like, I just can't. And I love steak. I mean, that's my go-to thing, but I just was getting so bored with it. And I think that probably was one of the reasons why I was losing weight, the palate fatigue. It's like, I'm just tired of eating steak. I'm like, I'm just going to stop eating. And you see what it did to Jordan Peterson and his daughter and some of their issues. It helps emphasize and highlight that some of our issues, our health issues, diseases, or whatever it may be, inflammation, could be dietary, and it could be resolved with changing the way we eat.
Yeah. Well, the central thing that's happening when you do a diet or do a nutritional intervention, largely is the weight loss effects, because that's the big overwhelming problem, and you can do that through different types of diets, and I think you're getting 80% of the benefits there. But I am an advocate for the ketogenic diet because we know that not all diets will have a profound anti-seizure effect. So this was very interesting to me, that a diet could change how your brain works. And I figured if it's doing it for epilepsy and correcting all the neurological problems, the etiology of epilepsy is incredibly complex, and we don't know. There's multiple reasons why people have seizures, but a ketogenic diet tends to work independent of the etiology, which means it works if you have a brain tumor, if you have a metabolic effect, metabolic derangement, if you have an imbalance in neurotransmitters, if you have a rare genetic disease like glucose transporter deficiency. So that's very interesting to me, and it means that we can leverage this nutrition for many other disorders that are pathophysiologically linked to brain abnormalities, whether it be metabolic or neuroinflammation. So as you mentioned, there are many diet tribes, and it becomes very sort of religious-like, and I've been an advocate for the ketogenic diet, but I don't try to proselytize people. My wife eats a lot of sugar and carbohydrates and does very well, and our blood work is pretty similar. Her triglycerides are a little bit higher, but our glucose levels are surprisingly about the same. So she's just by nature, genetically, and just through eating carbohydrates, she's a very good sugar burner. So I don't try to change that, and it does make it a little bit challenging sometimes. When she's buying food or we go out to eat or something like that. But generally, I think it's important to be accepting to other people. There's different diet tribes because the carnivore crowd, the keto zealots, if you want to call them that, they do recognize there's people in that group that have personal stories and their life has changed. And, I get so many emails every week by people who say this diet saved my life, usually the ketogenic diet, because they stumble upon my research. And, no doubt it has contributed to improving their health, and in some cases actually maybe save their life, especially with seizures and maybe certain types of cancers. So I'm here to be an advocate. I try to remain agnostic to the different types of diets. But I do feel that there are particular benefits that you can get from a ketogenic diet that you absolutely cannot get from any other diet. And that's why I chose to research it in an academic, setting and make a career out of it.
Absolutely. Yeah. So for people listening who want to keep up with your research, everything that you're involved in, assuming you still run ketonutrition.com and you are on some social media platforms, you want to let everybody know what's the best places to keep up with your updates?
Yeah, thanks for asking. ketonutrition.org. If you Google that, my name associated with that, you'll come up. And then we have a newsletter. So subscribe to the newsletter. I usually put things in the newsletter that I'll eventually write about in the blog. So we do have a blog, and we hit all the topics about how to pick the right ketone supplement, to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, to bipolar disorder and neurological. So there's a group later tonight, I'm part of a group called metabolic psychiatry. So this interesting concept that changing your nutrition, especially with a low carb diet, can help to treat things like schizophrenia, depression, bipolar. There's high level academic scientists that are NIH funded that are part of a group that study this. And
oh, you muted yourself. Oh, you're back.
So sorry about that.
That's great.
Yeah. So another emerging application of the ketogenic diet that we're very interested in is this idea of metabolic psychiatry. And I became more interested in how nutrition can affect your mood, because some of the data that's emerging out of our current clinical trial is using various metrics, including the GAD-7 test, which looks at anxiety, PHQ-9, and other tests that actually look at anxiety, depression, and mood. And some of the most robust data, it has actually been in psychological measures. We see nice changes in metabolic biomarkers, but some of the best data is actually in psychological. I didn't anticipate that, but it has actually got me to redirect the focus on this metabolic psychiatry. And we're doing a satellite meeting in addition at Metabolic Health Summit. We have a separate group of people that we're getting together to really talk about this topic, metabolic psychiatry. So we'd like to, bring more attention and awareness to that.
Awesome. Well, if you have anybody in that field that you think would be interesting, like, any suggestions, throw them to me, because I love people that
many.
Yeah. I absolutely.
Dr. Chris Palmer from Harvard is a spirit. He was a speaker, and we have a number of speakers on this topic. But I know Dr. Chris Palmer has done a number of podcasts and is very articulate and very good speaker on this topic.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll have to look into them, because I love people that just completely change the way you look at things, because so many times things get repeated over and over again. It gets accepted, and then there'll be somebody who's like, no, that's completely incorrect, and there's another way of looking at things. And at first you'll get pushback or whatever, but even the keto diet itself, I remember the first time I heard about it, and I'm like, well, it makes sense. But that means like the food pyramid that I grew up with is all wrong. It was like mind boggling. Like it just shows how something can be accepted and by the experts or whoever, or just get repeated over and over again. And then nobody really looks into it and sees if there's good science or if there's conflicting science or anything like that. It just becomes accepted. So I love when people just kind of turn things upside down. And even if I disagree with it or I'm not sure of it, I want to explore it, because there could be something there. Your first reaction sometimes, or not mine, but many people, my first reaction anytime I hear something that's like earth-shattering in regards to my worldview is like, I want to learn more about it. And I know many other people, their first reaction is to dismiss it. And I'm the opposite. I'm like, no, I want to know more. I've never even heard of this talked about in this way. When you first started speaking out about it and the benefits of it, that was a lot of people's reaction, was like, that sounds absolutely insane when you think about what I've been told my whole life. But thank you so much, Dr. Dominic D'Agostino. You are a just amazing at just explaining all the science, explaining all the benefits. I love the fact that you're also willing to talk about people like Dr. Thomas Seyfried or other people. I don't want to use the word fringe, but maybe are looking at things a little bit outside the box. And even like you said now, the possible benefits of depression. I mean, we know exercise helps with that type of stuff. It makes sense that there's other possibilities in regards to diet. Thank you so much for your time, your work, and we'll talk again, I'm sure. No, you're muted.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it, and for giving me a platform for having the curiosity to bring people like me on and delivering, this information to a broad audience. And I think that's really important. It has been important for my career. It motivates me to do more of what I'm doing. And and we try to bring also more attention to this by bringing top tier investigators, clinicians, and research scientists to Metabolic Health Summit, which will be in May 5th through 8th. So if people are interested, maybe if they can't attend, it's in Santa Barbara, California, but there's a virtual component. And there's tons of information that take a very deep dive into metabolic psychiatry, into cancer, into also optimization. So if you're just interested in optimizing your cognition and exercise performance, so we have a whole track on that. So I encourage you to go to Keto Nutrition and also go to Metabolic Health Summit if you're interested in more information, because you can go in person. We'd love to see you in person, but there's a virtual component. And I think if your listeners like what they hear today, there'll be a really good deep dive into actionable information in that conference.
That's awesome. Yeah, without a doubt. Why aren't you doing it in Florida? You figured...
We outgrew Florida. Actually, it started at the Embassy Suites at the USF College of Medicine. And, we didn't advertise or anything. And it was like 200 people. And there was all these people standing at the door wanting to get in. And we didn't. And then the next year, it went to like 600. And they were like, wow.
Oh, you muted again.
Sorry, I'm getting a call. And then it went to Long Beach, California. But now we settled. We have a great, fantastic venue in Santa Barbara, where we will be hosting at Santa Barbara. So encourage everybody to go out there if they can make it in person, because there's we want to make it a networking event. We have, live entertainment and stuff too. But this year we also will be having a virtual component.
Awesome. Yeah. Well, you're also one of the reasons why people who are now character assassinating people like Joe Rogan, saying that he's not down the middle. It's like if you look back at his past interviews, when he had you on, he also had Norton on and was trying to be fair with both sides. He did a similar thing with Gary Taubes when he had Gary Taubes on. He also, with his huge platform, helped bring popularity to the diet by having people like yourself on and Chris Kresher and Rob Wolf and all the amazing people that have been on there. So so thank you so much for doing these interviews. I always say one of the most important things about diet and health podcasts is, unlike when I do a podcast on history or something like that, people who are listening can actually implement something that could be life-changing and could improve, or at least could improve their life slightly. I think that's why some of these shows are so important to me, to get out there and get this information out there. So, but enjoy the rest of your day in Florida, and hopefully we speak again, and keep up the great work.
Thank you, Ricky. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Take care.
Take good care. Bye-bye.
I believe in the ripple effect.